Hey everyone, Action Movie Dad here with a making of tutorial of this claw machine effect. So the other day James and I were at a car wash waiting for the car to come out. When he wanted to play this claw machine, I explained that they're kind of a waste of money, but we had a little back and forth and I let him spend $1 on it to kind of find out that it doesn't work so great. So we kind of envisioned this little revenge fantasy of being able to pull up your own control stick and do this. So I shot this all really roughly and quickly on my iPhone, got it home, and threw it into Premiere. So one of my favorite features of Premiere is that you can take any piece of footage and quickly transition it into After Effects to work on it. So I take the piece of footage I need, I right-click on it, and say Replace with After Effects Composition. That moves everything over into this empty AE file that I have. I'm going to run my script called Create Folders, which allows me to kind of sort out where I'm putting things just to keep the project organized as I work along. We've got a nice camera move in here, and we've got James standing there, so I'm going to say Track Camera. I'm going to try this without garbage matting him. And it all looks like it worked out beautifully. I can use the built-in tracking tools, which allow me to select multiple points to define a plane. I'll start off by grabbing a ground plane and saying Set Ground Plane and Origin. That'll store kind of the data of this 3D space on this floor. I did a Create Solid and Camera, which allows me to have this solid, which is right on the floor. I can do the same thing on multiple planes throughout this composition to have placeholders for the front of this arcade machine, and rotate that into place. I can rotate the ground plane kind of into place, stretch it out. I'm going to add a checkerboard effect. This just allows me to see the perspective on the floor a little bit better so I can help align it with the actual geometry of the room. There you go. Create a plane on the side of the arcade box. Then I'm going to pan up on this later part of the footage and select something that kind of defines the ceiling. I'm going to use that checkerboard trick again. And once I have placeholders for all these, I have a nicely tracked scene. And I know the ceiling is floating a little bit, but I'll rotate it a little bit to try to compensate. But as long as it looks pretty solid in that area straight above the machine, I feel pretty good about my chances. I'm going to do a Google search to kind of find out what kind of claw I'm interested in. I don't really know what these are called. So doing a brief bit of research here, it turns out that these are usually called construction grabs or excavator grabs. So I'm going to search that on TurboSquid, and I have a lot of options here, which is really great. This shape right here in the middle is the one that I think I really like the most, but it also costs $39, and that's a little pricey. It looks like a great model though. So I'm going to try to searching the term claw and looking through to see if there's anything that comes in at a lower price point. Next page. And check out this guy right over here. $14, claw. It's got a great shape. I think that if I took that and retextured it, I could really make it into something construction-like. Looks like a beautiful mesh, it's well made, and $14 is way better than $40 in my book. So we'll buy it. I'm here in Cinema 4D, where I'm going to do some wrecking of this model so I can prep it for Element 3D. Now here's the model. It looks really great. It's got really solid geometry. It'll be perfect for my purposes. One of the things that I've gotten pretty familiar with is taking a Cinema 4D prop and making it optimized for Element 3D. I'm opening up the hierarchy to see that it looks like there are plenty of individual pieces that I can use to break this thing apart for animation in Element 3D. I'm deleting the scene cameras and lights because I don't really need them. And next I'm going to poke around in the model because Element 3D likes to have all of the 3D parts rasterized. In Cinema 4D, sometimes there's something like a spline or a shape that's being interpolated or kind of made within the program, but it's best to bake out this geometry. So it looks like someone has already baked a lot of these, because I see a lot of the HyperNerve objects are already disabled and probably may have been flattened already. So that's great. I'm going to go ahead and flatten everything here. Now it'll be easy enough to animate this in Element 3D, but I'm going to simplify it a lot. I really just need one of these pistons, one of the claw pieces, and this central shaft. And I'm also going to simplify the textures so I can apply a couple of construction style colors to this thing. I'm going to apply some yellow construction paint, have a base metal for everything, and right now I'm just going through, I'm fast forwarding through this, but really I'm just finding different parts and labeling them with a couple of different textures, just so I can have a mix of metals and materials when I bring it into Element 3D and want to colorize this thing to look like one of those other construction claws we saw earlier. One little tip if you are doing this drag and drop material applying is to make sure that all of your meshes only have one material on them. Sometimes there are a few and Element gets a little bit confused. It defaults to the first, even though in Cinema 4D it looks like you've already painted it. So now that that's done, I'm going to optimize it for the animation I'm going to do in Element 3D. So I'm going to find the main group of this and open up its coordinates. Oh, it's probably this thing. So it's rotated at 144. I'm going to zero that out. That way when I bring this in, I'll have everything kind of aligned at a 0-degree rotation, and then within Element I can arrange these. I'll show you that all later. Right now I'm going to create 3 groups. A group for this claw, which I'm going to label fork. Actually, why not just label it claw? I'm going to relabel this thing piston. It kind of looks like a piston to me. And we'll just leave that called the claw shaft. Now that I have these 3 parts, I'm actually going to save each of the parts individually as different Cinema 4D files. So, for example, I'll delete everything except the claw, and then save this as part claw. Press undo. Delete everything except for the piston. Do the same thing. Part piston. Undo, undo. And delete everything except for the shaft. And now I'm going to come into After Effects, create a new solid. And once that's created, I'm going to apply Element 3D. And we'll go into the scene setup. I'll click on Import. I'll go to my 3D files, and I'm going to import all 3 of those parts together. I don't need to load animation. Okay, great. And uh-oh, it looks like a piece is missing from the shaft, I believe. Right here, there's supposed to be a cylinder. So, I know what happened, and I'd mentioned it earlier, but let's open up Cinema 4D again and find that shaft file. So I'm going to open up the shaft file, and as I was mentioning earlier, Element likes to have everything baked into an actual mesh. And these cylinders, you can see by the icon to the side of them, it's a little cylinder shape. It's being created in Cinema 4D based on instructions. But if I say make editable, right-clicking on all of these, you'll see that little icon turns into a mesh triangle icon next to them. So when I save that file and come back into Element, watch, boom, all my pieces are back. So it's a little silly thing, and I've had that trouble before when trying to import something. I'm diving into Pro Shaders 2 to try to find a handful of metal textures. The scene materials have all of the textures that came in with all these individual pieces, but if I can add these materials to my library and then apply them to everything, I can really simplify having, 10 or 15 textures down to just having 2 or 3. I'm going to change the texture mapping to box repeat, just because it kind of puts the texture nicely on all the different surfaces. This will depend wildly on your model and whether it has nice UV mapping or not. Next, I'm going to try to create a texture that works well for this construction yellow, kind of that Wall-E / bulldozer texture. I'm going to start with this metal black chips as a base. I don't really like the way that's being applied, so I'm going to change the UV mapping to, it works all right. So I like the chips and pieces in this, but I'm going to try to make it look like it's painted yellow. It looks like I'm getting a weird line here. I don't know if it's coming from the reflection map, so I'm going to change the environment map to something that looks a little bit like the inside of this car wash. And didn't really help that seam, so I'm going to try a few different methods. Let's try box. That seems okay. Box cylinder? It's not bad either. What I'm looking at right now is the glossiness and kind of the little texture imperfections in this claw right now. Then I'm going to find that element separately, and I'm going to mess with the color. I want this to be yellow, like a standard construction crane or whatever, but there's a lot of glossiness and reflectivity on it right now that's not really making it look like that. So I'm going to need to improvise now. Let's try turning down the diffuse texture, seeing how much of the yellow shows through. A little bit. I'm going to switch this to something more grungy that has... There we go. If I turn that back up, that comes in a little bit darker now. If I turn the reflectivity texture down, what this does is it says how much does this metal grunge affect the reflectivity. I'm not going to explain every step here. I'm just going to mess around until it kind of looks like what I'm expecting it to. So I'm going to go through and figure out a couple more textures to apply to everything. And once I find the few that I like the most, I can jump over to my scene materials, and then I can start applying these textures to all of the individual little parts. I can open the pieces to see what I've textured already, and replace all of the default textures that it came in with these new ones from my library. Once that's all done, I can right-click in here and say remove unused materials, and now I just have 3 materials controlling everything in the scene. It's just a simple way to be able to change something later without having to deal with 20 textures. Alright, so this next part gets a little detailed. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set up this claw to be easily animated using the auxiliary channels in Element 3D. If I turn off everything except for the shaft, I'm going to align this piece with the... Whoops. I'm going to align it from the bottom here. That'll put it right there. And then I'm going to take this claw and piston, and I'm going to put them in their own separate group. Alright, once they're in their own group, I'm going to make sure that that group is actually a subfolder of my original group 1 folder. That's important for them to show up later. And now I'm going to take each of these pieces and I'm going to align their axis center to fit where I would like them to pivot from. Does that make sense? Are you following me? I'm going to animate these using Element 3D's auxiliary channel tools. So for that, I need to take each piece and click on the axis center and move it to where I want that geometry to pivot from. Does that make sense? So I'm trying to find a part where the claw could rotate from, like this. And I'm going to assign its alignment to auxiliary channel 1. I know I need to reposition this a little bit. Whoops, I need to uncheck that. And now I can move it. And and I'll move it down here somewhere. I think that in the real model they're just intersecting, and honestly I don't think it'll be all that noticeable once I have everything together. So there's the axis center for that claw piece. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the piston. I'll select it, I'll enable the axis transform mode, and for this one I'm actually going to use the left view so I can just see this exactly from an orthographic kind of view, and align that exactly in the center of that circle. Perfect. So now what this will do is this piston will rotate from this joint, and I'm going to assign its rotation to, whoops, I keep on doing that. I'm going to assign the rotation of this to auxiliary channel 2. So let's go ahead and set that. Now that I've assigned auxiliary channels to both of those pieces, I can actually duplicate this whole group. There are a couple ways to do this. I can right-click and say duplicate model, and that'll give me a whole separate, whoops, that'll give me a separate group here. And I can also hold down Alt and drag, and when I do that, it duplicates this group. I know I need 5 of these, and I need them to be aligned in increments all around this circle. Hey Siri, what is 360 divided by 5?
It's 72.
Thank you. So with a group folder selected, I can manually enter an orientation on the y-axis, 72, and then just kind of go successively around and rotate these guys to increments of 72. I'm going to kind of fast forward through me rotating these all to increments of 72, so they'll fit perfectly around this little pentagon shape at the bottom of the claw. And once they're kind of there, I can switch the top view and align them perfectly, just using the little gizmos to make sure that I'm translating them only in the X and Z. And voila! Check this out, it looks like the whole claw model now, using just the 3 parts we simplified this to earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And here's the magic of this all. Check this out. I'm going to create a null for this claw object. Let's move it up here somewhere so we can see a little bit better. I clicked on F11 to switch to a custom view, and from here I'm going to see basically all of those stand-in solids that I had. And if I zoom all the way out, I get a sense of the scene. I can see that that claw is floating kind of near the stand-in box. I can now use its null to kind of align it right in the middle, so I know that it is directly kind of in the middle of this box somewhere. I'm going to grab the orientation from my ground plane and apply it to my null for the claw. Rotate it 90 degrees this way, and now I know that it's kind of aligned to the world Y axis. Pressing F12, I go back to my regular camera's view, and I can move this Element 3D layer up here, and let's rename it E3D Claw. I can resize the whole claw element using the null object that I've created. Off the bat, I always love to dive into the render settings and enable the ambient occlusion, just because I really love ambient occlusion. It's my favorite. Crank this up super high. And now I'm going to show you some of those auxiliary channels and how they pay off. If I dial into the particle look and aux channels, if I grab channel 1's rotation, watch this. That claw opens and can close with the rotation of this. It's so cool, I can't even describe how happy I am about it. Channel 2 also has rotation, so I can rotate these pistons up and down kind of as that claw opens and closes. So it's not really the way it's working mechanically. There's a lot more complexity in a real piston system, but all I need is a little bit of this to look convincing enough when it's opening and closing that you don't really have to worry about those kind of details. I'm going to fast forward through this next part a little bit because it's really all about me scrubbing through and setting keyframes for the position of the null object and for the rotation of those claw elements. I try to animate it so as the claw comes down, it closes right on the machine and then proceeds to head back up into the ceiling. I'm adding a little bit of rotation on the claw so it looks like it's dangling from a chain or something like that at the beginning. And honestly, you end up messing with this a million times to make it work for your purposes. So the specifics aren't important here, but I think right here I'm realigning where my null object is, and that's so I can add some rotation that makes it look a little bit more like it's swinging and dangling instead of rotating from the center of the claw palm, as it were. Now, the next thing that I do is something I totally didn't think I was going to do for this. My original plan was to grab some still pieces of the arcade machine, and because it's basically a rectangle, I was going to take that, get a couple planes in After Effects, and kind of fudge a 3D object out of it, because it would have worked all right, and it's the way I've gone in the past. In the McDonald's video, for example, I took pictures of 3 sides of the McDonald's rocket ship thing, and then just made them into 3 planes in After Effects, and it's not really a 3D object, it's just those 3 planes, and it kind of works. I was going to do the same thing here, but then something compelled me to try doing it in Cinema 4D with real 3D parts so everything could be rendered in Element. So here's a little detour where I build a claw machine in Cinema 4D and prove that I never have a plan going in. So luckily I had the thought to take still images of this claw machine while I was there, which is great because I'm going to use this as a source for the textures of a 3D model for it. I'm going to use some of the After Effects tools, including CC Power Pin, just because it has some of my favorite controls for extrapolating a flat surface out of something that was photographed in perspective. Let me show you what I mean. Within a new comp created from my original image, I'm going to apply the effect CC Power Pin. I'm going to then disable it and place the control points on 4 corners of the front of this arcade machine. Now I know it's not really perfectly flat, and some of you have called me on this, but it'll work all right, because when I go back to the checkbox and enable this effect, I get a nice flat version of the front of the machine. Then I'm going to do another trick. I'm going to duplicate the layer and go to the other copy of CC Power Pin, disable it, and move these 2 points over to the other side of the machine. That way, when I re-enable the effect, I'm basically getting this other side of the arcade machine, but all of the pixels on the spline, like right on the front corner of the machine, will line up exactly. So there's no misalignment, I'll get the exact same thing. Even though it's horizontally flipped, I get a great texture out of that. I'm going to save still images of these 2 pieces, and then use them as textures as jumping off points in Cinema 4D. Now, I'm by no means a Cinema 4D expert, so you guys might be screaming at the screen to me through all of this, but I'm going to take this one step at a time. We're going to create a cube. Nice. And then, just so I understand the scale a little bit, I'm going to create some materials and bring in those textures that we had talked about earlier. So I'm going to load in front texture. Then let's apply that just to see what it looks like on this cube. I can use, and this is a rough guide to scale this properly. So it's kind of taller. Square that up a little bit. Great. Now this cube right now just has kind of a 1:1 resolution, so I'm going to go into its properties and enable a bunch more segments in the X and Y. Like subdivisions, basically. Same for Z, of course. But this way, when I do deforming to the mesh, or if I punch some holes out or something like that, I'll have some actual definition, and I won't get those really weird planes as much as if I had no points at all. I'm going to create a new cube, and I'm going to use this to basically punch holes through parts of this machine. So if you see what I'm doing right now, I made this square that punches right through it. I'm going to use a tool called booling, which allows you to subtract 3D information from one object with the 3D information from another object. I'm going to do this twice. So I think to do that twice, I need to say goodness. Bool. Awesome. I'll add my original square and then subtract one square from it. What have I done? These are out of order. There we go. So I've subtracted one object. I don't know if you can subtract two objects. Nope. I was going to stick with... never mind. We're going to make this into a new object. And then we're going to bool out that other square like this. Where the hell was it? Like I said, not an expert at this part, folks. Bool. I'm going to create a bool object whereby the first object will have its geometry subtracted by the geometry of the second object. So if I turn off everything except for this, you see that I've created this really simplified version of the arcade. And that's exactly what I was going for. So, real simple geometry, and yeah, not too difficult. I'm going to take this whole thing and say current state to object, which makes everything into actual meshes. Really just these three meshes, which I can move outside and delete everything else. When I look at the real images of this arcade machine, it turns out that it's really not all that thick at all. So I'm going to save this real quick so I can load it up in Element later. But then I'm going to look at these extruded interior sections, which I don't really need, so I'm going to just eliminate them. Now, I totally should have done this earlier, but I'm going to create a second material that uses that side texture that I created earlier. And I need to apply it to this mesh, but I want to apply it only to the side of the machine. Now, this would have been much faster if I'd done it earlier, but I forgot. So I'm going to use the selection tool when I'm in the mesh mode and select, turns out I'm going to manually select all of the side pieces. There we are. And then I'm going to paint them with this texture. Great. So now the whole side of the arcade has this side profile. I got some issue here because I didn't realize the window didn't really get punched through like this. Another symptom of me not thinking about this enough before I went and punched those holes and made this into a geometry. But again, I'm going to lean back on the fact that this was not ever the primary thing I'm good at. So I could fix that, but I don't want to. So I'm going to skip to the next step, which is creating a cube, moving it up here, and I'm going to scale it down just to fit right inside the machine here. So if you can imagine it's just a square slightly smaller than the whole machine. And I'm going to texture it with a new material that is effectively glass. For preview purposes, I'm going to make this material have some transparency, which is in the material settings. I can check transparency. Let's go to the default because I'm going to retexture it in Element anyway. But now I have all of these sides, which is really great. And what I need now to make the rotation on this convincing in the render is something to fill the bottom and something to kind of fill up the base. So I'm going to browse around online and see if I can find something to work for this. Back on Turbo Squid, I'm going to search for toy. Let's find something free. Here's a teddy bear. That'll work just fine. Let's download it. Save, blah, blah, blah. Excellent. Import it into Cinema 4D. And I feel like I remember that there's a way, oh geez. first we gotta scale this little bugger down. Great. So now it's smaller, but still kind of big. Goodness. Scale them down, down, down. Excellent. Now I need to make kind of a bunch of these and a variety of them as well. So I'm going to fast forward through this a bit, but what I'm going to do is I'm playing around with the surface of these bears, the main fur texture, so I can kind of do a variety of colors, 3 or 4 colors, so they look a little bit like the assorted toys in that machine. And I'm going to try using the grid and array tools in Cinema 4D, both which I don't know enough about, to try to populate these bears. What I kind of ended up doing was just creating rows of bears, randomly rotating a few, and then duplicating that whole semi-random line and populating the machine with the bottom of it. I then searched around online to try to find a claw machine claw that kind of looked like the other one, and then I realized I already had a claw, one that I downloaded at the beginning of this thing, and it's so small in frame I'm just going to use that again, but textured chrome instead of like a construction thing. Once I scaled and got that into place, one of the other things I needed was to kind of fill in these negative space sections of the arcade machine, like up here at the top. So I created a few cubes, kind of scrunched them down just to fit in the small space at the top, kind of occupy that. And then also I needed to create a backplate, like in the original arcade machine. Now, luckily I have a still image of this part of the arcade machine. It's not the full thing. I need to do a few things to it first. I'm going to square it up using the transform tools. I'm going to kind of grab this claw section and I'm going to expand my selection a little bit and then use the content aware fill, which is under edit fill content aware. And what that does is it kind of tried to automatically clone stamp out that section a little bit. I'm still going to try to transform this into more square, and then I'm going to use one of my favorite tricks, which is the smudge brush turned up all the way to 100%, where I can take the paint and just kind of smear it to the edge to create extra parts. I'm going to save this as the backplate. Great. And then I realize I need this to be actually a little bit taller, so I'm going to do a weird cheat to do that. I'm going to adjust the canvas size to be taller, and then I'm going to incrementally grab parts of the bottom of the image and stretch them out to fill the rest of this space. So I'm going to grab this section, stretch it out, that, stretch it out more, this, stretch it out more, and so on. Just so basically this will all be hidden behind the toys anyway, but I wanted it to look like a tall backplate. I'll resave that. Great. Now I can apply that as a texture to a plane that I throw at the back of this arcade machine. So create a new material, load in the image of the back panel, apply that, rotate this, there we go, position, scale it, now again, I am not an expert at all in creating 3D objects, but I'm really pleased that this is such a simple object and it comes together as looking relatively 3D, which is great. Now that it's 3D, I can have it really interacting with that 3D claw in Element 3D, and I could also do some extras in it that I wouldn't have been able to do in the 2D layer cheated version. So we're going to jump into some of that now. So if I take a look at my original comp, I like the idea of the claw coming down and kind of crushing the top of this machine, and then when the claws hit it, the sides just kind of bending in like it was just kind of a weak metal shell compared to this really powerful claw. So I'm going to select a couple pieces of my mesh, enable the keyframing, Then I need to enable the point level animation. What that means is it'll remember to record every little transformation that I do to any point in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a keyframe at 0 frames where nothing has happened, then scrub through to like 50 frames, set a new keyframe, go to mesh mode on the main arcade piece, and I'm just grabbing a handful of pieces, like this corner, bending it inward. Cool. Record that. Now as I scrub through the keyframes, you can see things are sort of starting to happen. Every animation is going to be your own thing. So I'm going to fast forward through a little bit of this, but really what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing points and literally just setting a 2 keyframe thing where there's no transformation at frame 0, and then by frame 50 a bunch of crap has happened to this machine. All of these little points get bent out of shape, and I think in my final render this will look like the whole machine is being crushed a little bit like metal. That's the hope. When this is finally all done, I use a plugin called Nitro Bake, which I can use to have Cinema 4D bake out every transformation that happens into something that is more like a rigid geometry. And then I can run a secondary plugin on this whole group called Riptide Pro. So what Riptide Pro does is that it'll convert every frame of the Cinema 4D animation into a separate OBJ file, so you can load it as an OBJ sequence in Element 3D. Now there are some elements of animation that will be imported nicely from Cinema 4D right into Element 3D, but this point level deforming of the mesh and everything working together wasn't really working out, and I had to learn a few lessons about what was making my OBJ sequence too big and what was making it too small. I ended up outputting all this animation without the teddy bears present, and then I was able to load them in as a separate object. You'll see that all happen later. The important thing I did was I imported a 3D sequence, found those OBJ files, and then loaded them in. And then I'm able to test if my animation worked out. So I'm going to align this whole thing from the bottom, and then I'm going to go up to the object and test whether the pre-baked animation worked. If I scroll through the start frame, it's a quick cheat way to see if the animation got imported, and it looks like it did this time. You can see from my scene materials that I've tried this before and it failed. So in any case, I'm saving you the time of seeing that error, and I'm just grabbing my textures from my previous attempt at this and applying them back to this lovely claw machine. Now, one of the textures on this claw machine is the glass. In Pro Shaders, they have a whole section called Translucent, and I often reach for this as a way to do glass in Element 3D. Under Translucent, there are a couple different glass textures, and I'm going to use this rough one. And it's neat, but in its current state, it's not transparent. So I've got to go into that material itself and do a few adjustments. One of the main things is I can change the blending mode of a texture to, from normal to screen, which is kind of cool. So just like in After Effects, when you adjust a blending mode, you can make it so this glass level is actually screening itself on top of everything. I can also adjust the forced opacity right here, so I can make it a little bit more obvious or less obvious, and once you look at it in comp, you'll be able to tell if it's really working for you or not. Finally, it's time to bring in that claw machine into my actual comp. I'm going to go to Group 2 and create a null for it, and just so I don't get confused later, I'm going to rename this one the machine null, and I'm going to rename this one the claw null, so I can remember what those help control overall. If I go to my machine null, I can actually copy some properties of these other rotation values that I've had before. I'm now holding down Shift to rotate this by 45-degree increments, so I know that this machine is now aligned to what the floor plane thinks it's supposed to be. I can move that to the center of where the machine is supposed to be located, scale it up, and I'm going to try to scale it to basically line up with the original claw machine, and in this case it includes adjusting the Y scale a little bit. Now there's the baked in animation, so the machine looks already crushed at this point, but I can fix this by going into Element and finding a keyframe for the baked animation settings, or keys. I'll show you what I mean. Right here is the playback speed, and if I set a keyframe for that and set it to 0, I can then move 1 frame forward and set the playback speed to 100. And what that does is it keeps the whole animation frozen until right at the moment when I want it to start getting crushed by this claw. So now as I play through, right at the moment the top of that claw starts pressing on the machine, it starts crunching down a little bit like a can. And as the claws start to close in from the side, you'll see the sides start to get punctured a little bit, and for the plexiglass planes to start bending inward. So there's not a whole lot of detail in that plexiglass, and I'm going to address that later with some really cool techniques. So right now it looks really simple video game-like, and I'm going to try to make it look like slightly enhanced, a little bit better than video game-like by the end. How about that? I'm creating a new null called Crane Up, and it's a 3D object, and I'm copying the last position of the machine from it. And then what I can do with this is it'll have the same keyframes as the claw that's pulled up into the ceiling, but only from this point forward, from the middle of my comp on. That way, if I parent the machine to this null, it will move up in synchronization with the claw. It's basically a hack to have this parented to that object, but only halfway through the scene. Now that I know I'm going to see a lot of the bottom of the machine as it comes up, I'm going to need something to kind of put on the bottom of this machine here. The real one has some wheels, some little casters on it, so we're going to try to see if we can make the bottom of this more interesting. I very quickly find a cheap version of just what I need. Stratocaster. I like the detail of this one, so I'm going to go ahead and buy that and then bring it into Element 3D. I'm going to start with, first off, I'm going to texture a little cube on the bottom here. And then I'm going to go ahead and import those casters. Right. Now, the unfortunate thing about this caster was that it came in without a lot of separation in the texture, so just one thing, which is kind of blah, but I don't really feel like going into Cinema 4D and cleaning it up. I'm going to sort through a couple of different texture applications, see which looks the best, and once I'm happy, I will duplicate it 4 times and place it all around the bottom of this, so there's a little bit going on. Take a peek at that in comp. I realize I don't really like this bottom texture, so I'm going to scale the wheels down and pick something else. So now that we're getting pretty close to the object that's going to be removed from the screen, I need to fix what is going to be behind that object when it's left. So if I zoom in on this arcade machine here, it's called Cruisin' Exotica. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get a clean image of what the side of that cabinet looked like while I was there on site, so I'm going to have to do a little bit of research. I'm going to Google images for the Cruisin' Exotica cabinet and see if I can find something that is a worthwhile resolution image of the side of it. Getting closer. So I'm going to go to the tools in Google and say I need a large image and see what it comes back with. It looks like this is pretty good, and I think that these must be from the same site. It's a top and bottom view. I'm going to save these 2 images and then do a little photoshopping. Save the top. Save the bottom. And then I'm going to go into Photoshop. In Photoshop, I can open those two files, and then I can go to File, Automate, Photo Merge. And what that does is it'll take different photos and combine them together. So it'll think about it for a second. And then returns me one file where it's kind of automatically put these two together. Now, obviously, I need to flatten these, do a little bit of adjustment, and try to put it a little bit more square. It's really confusing because it's a bizarre shape, so I'm just going to try to do the best I can with imagining what is the flat version of this. I'm going to kind of stretch out some sides and try to fill in any part that didn't end up in the picture, like that, and sort of erase it. There we go. Clip off the sides, and now I have this nice piece that I can put in. Back in After Effects, I can use those camera tracker tools to try to create a plane that aligns with the side of the arcade cabinet. And then if I import my Photoshop file of the side, I'm just going to bring in just that one layer. I can actually swap and replace that, and it'll put it right here in 3D space, and look at this. It's like I'm erasing the background in this cool way. Now, obviously, there were a lot of adjustments done to my original, so there's probably going to be some weird alignment issues, but I'm going to try to make it as close as possible. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to use some weird liquefy tricks in here. Looks like that cabinet actually goes down lower in real life than it did in my version, so I'm going to have to do something about that. But we'll stick with this for now. We're going to try Riptide and try sliding down the bottom of the arcade machine. I don't know why that's not working. Oh, I know why that's not working. I'm going to jump back into Photoshop here, and I need to trim. Actually, let me just paint down the bottom of this machine. Sorry, weird-fingered lady. Once that looks good enough, I can save the file and it'll automatically propagate right back into After Effects. To get this to really line up, I'm going to have to do a couple of other things. I'm going to add a mesh warp and kind of move some pieces around a little bit until it's lining up nicely. And I'm also going to do a little bit of color adjustment. I'm going to have it match the color of the background footage. And if I adjust the brightness and contrast a little bit, I get something that I think looks like what it would look like all by itself. So let me play that for you. So it looks kind of cool. It's almost like there's a render order error, which is kind of neat. We're going to move on to the other background objects as well. I found a nice in-focus frame that shows a lot of that red wall up there, and I'm going to render a still frame of it. Then I can take that still frame here. Actually, I meant to put it into Photoshop. I can import it in Photoshop over here. And now I can use a really cool tool called Vanishing Point. Now what Vanishing Point does is it allows you to define a plane inside Photoshop. I'm going to try to basically imagine a grid that would fit on this wall here. So I'm a little bit off. I can adjust the points until this little blue grid as a guide is lined up with the same perspective cues on the wall. And then the really cool thing happens. Once it looks aligned enough, I can go to the stamp tool, like a clone stamp, select somewhere on here, and then watch this. As I stamp the tool, it's respecting the perspective laid out by that grid. So this isn't the same as your standard stamp tool. It's actually trying to calculate the new angles created by the perspective plane you established. Does that make sense? So I'm going to do this a bunch. Obviously it's getting a little clone stampy in here, but I'm going to try to do a few corrections on that later until I have a nice empty wall. Once that wall feels done to me, I'm going to go ahead and use Photoshop to kind of undo that perspective, square up this wall like that, and then I can save this wall layer so I can throw it back into After Effects and add something behind that arcade machine. Save this as the wall, la la la. I'll put it right on the plane right here, apply it, scale it up, add some masks, and you get it. When I preview this through, you can kind of see what's starting to happen as this arcade machine is pulled up away. There's now kind of an empty space down there, which is great. I've neglected the ground plane, which I actually won't do until the very, very end of this all. Next, I'm going to add a few lights to this scene so I can try to approximate the look of the real objects on the screen. Now, I'm not going to get too complicated. I'm going to use a couple of spotlights that are coming from where the bright spots on the screen are and where some of the windows were leaking through until this object is within the realm of the photorealism of the scene. One great way to make your scene, or rather your 3D rendered object, seem a little bit more real in scene is to have cast shadows that come from the real objects in the scene kind of come onto it. So in Element, I'm going to create a new group and fill it with primitives, just really simple cubes. I'm going to stack them like this, and what I'm approximating in a really generic way is the shape of this carpet stand. This carpet stand right next to the claw machine should be casting some ambient occlusion shadows and some cast shadows onto that machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave it visible for a moment and place the object and just watch what happens to the claw machine. It's casting a little bit of shadow on it. And the fun thing that I can do with that shadow is if I go back into Element 3D, I can tell that material to be not visible to camera, but it'll still cast shadows. So if I go to the light settings and turn up the diffusion of the shadows and change the quality of the ray trace shadows, I can get this nice diffuse cast looking shadow off of this carpet right onto the machine. And that really helps marry it to the scene a little bit better. You can kind of see all of the lighting things that are happening to this right now. I'm going to go to some different views to try to play with how everything's interacting. The more sideways the light can be coming in, the more definition your object will get. But since most of my things are kind of filmed in real life, that it's rarely movie kind of lighting. It's usually this boring, flat, realistic lighting. So I just need to tweak and tweak until I get a look that I like. I'm fast forwarding through this again because the specifics don't really matter, but the idea is you got to go through and just play and tinker with your lighting, your light direction, and all sorts of things on any CG element. And I don't get it perfect. I'm not an expert at this. I try my best, but I usually just settle at some point where it looks pretty darn good. That's my gold standard. I came to the realization that when the ceiling bursts open, it would be nice if there were this bright, like almost overexposed sunlight shining right down on the claw from above that casts some really stark shadows. I feel like if there were a hole in the ceiling, it would be really bright, and it would overwhelm the iPhone camera, just the way the windows are overblown in the background. So I'm going to try to create a light, and I'm going to turn it up absurdly high, just to see what kind of interactive sunlight I could get. The way it overexposes right there and blows itself out is really kind of nice. I'm definitely going to turn up this light pretty high so it feels like a shaft of light coming down from above. now I need an actual hole for that light to be coming through. So I'm going to use one of those ceiling solids I had created before. I'm going to draw a simple shape on it. Looks a little bit broken up. I'm going to mess around with the roughened edges on it until I get kind of a broken up, random looking shape that I like. Now apologies because I filmed this a little bit out of order, but what I'm going to do is I know I need a lot of duplicates of this mask. So I'm going to take the duplicate and I'm going to add an expression to the mask path and link it to the mask path on the original. I can rename the original master, and that way anytime I need a duplicate of this exact shape, including if I want to change the mask shape later, I can do it in this master, and all of the copies will be copying the mask shape because of this expression. Now there are several components you need to make a hole in the ceiling look kind of convincing. One is the foreground edge of the ceiling that would appear in front of anything coming down through it. So I'm going to duplicate a piece of the footage and mask off just this front foreground edge of the hole. So if you see the claw going up through it, that little part of the ceiling will obscure it a little bit. I need to set some manual keyframes on this mask. There are probably better ways to do this, but just working quickly here through it. The next thing we need is we need to fill a copy of that hole with a sky texture, something that you would see through it. So I'm going to bring in this piece, make it a 3D layer that is way up high above and behind everything, so there's a little bit of parallax, but it's going to be using a copy of that original mask shape as its alpha. So let me hook that up. And if I correct the layer stack order a little bit, there we go. You can see the sky through that hole and the claw kind of in front of it. So that's great. And the last piece of this I need is something to add some thickness to this hole so it looks like it's an actual ceiling. I'm going to take another copy of my ceiling solid, and I'm going to import this debris texture I have. It's kind of a clone brushed together debris of all sorts piece that I like to use for Action Movie Kit. As you see, if I align it up here with a ceiling, kind of rotate it around until I find a part of the texture I'm interested in. I'm using just the widgets, the little gizmos, to move it around up here so it's staying aligned with the ceiling plane. And once I find a nice crumbly, rocky, appropriate piece of it that looks kind of like it could be a broken ceiling, I'm going to draw a mask to just shave off this little part of the ceiling right here. Invert that mask. I'm going to add some roughened edges, kind of break up the edges there. And because it's 3D and aligned with the ceiling, I also, I think, raised it up a teeny bit. It'll really have the effect of a ceiling that has some depth pulled away at it. Now, I'm doing a really rough job on this because I know that some lighting is going to really help obscure this part of the comp. My overlit ceiling is going to be based on a 3D adjustment layer that I put up here. I'm going to use the 3D adjustment layer to add kind of a glow. So if you see what I mean, it's this 3D layer, it's set to adjustment mode. I've put a mask on it and I'm adding a bit of a glow around that whole area. And then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create an adjustment layer that uses one of my favorite plugins, Shine. Shine is part of the Trapcode suite, and it creates those awesome God rays that kind of emanate from a center point. What I like to do is on the position for the Shine locator, I like to use a null object or a stand-in from another object. So in this case, I think I attempted to link it up to my glow layer, but then I realized that it would be more controllable if I actually had a null object that I could move around more freely. So I'm creating a null object, and I'm using an expression to link its position to the position of the shine beams. So watch this. As I move around this null through space, it kind of adjusts where the light is coming from. It's really extreme right now, and right now when it's behind that machine, it's not working great, but if I pull it up and behind, you really start to get the sense of volumetric lighting coming through that hole. And I imagine because the ceiling was just caved in that there'd be plenty of dust in the atmosphere to even create some light rays. And just the way your camera would have trouble exposing outdoors and indoors at the same time, I'm letting it look overblown like this. Now at this point my comp's getting a little bit heavy, so I'm going to take a step out of here for a moment and just work with the 3D elements so I can try to pre-render them. So, a little crash there, but we're back. I'm going to solo my 3D claw layer, and I'm going to make a duplicate of it and do one of my favorite new tricks with Element 3D, which is to use the output world position mode. Now what this does is, you'll see when I switch it on, it switches to this black and white look, and that's kind of weird. What it's really doing is it's creating an abstract 3D point that is located based on these coordinates here, and you can create a radius that creates effectively a depth map of sorts. Element 3D does have a Z-depth rendering property, but I like the control of the world position output. Now you'll see as I position this kind of invisible spot around, it's located effectively in the middle of my 3D claw and machine, and with a little bit of tweaking in these settings, the feathering and everything, I can create something that looks a lot like a depth map of this machine, this claw. I'm getting some good definition from the front tines as they come down and of the machine. And the neat thing about this is if I were to pre-render a version of it, or even use as is, but I'm going to pre-render it for speed, I can output this and then use it as a Luma mat for other 3D elements like dust particles falling or sparks from the ceiling, and it'll do this really cool keying thing where it looks like the smoke or the dust is half interacting with the actual 3D object instead of being only composited in front or behind of it. Now that was not a great description, but if you go over to hey, it's Andrew Kramer's version of this tutorial, he does a much better job explaining what world position really means and how useful it can be in compositing. So jumping forward a bit, I'm going to render out this depth map, save it somewhere, and then bring it back into this project. And once I've done that, I can also bring in some Action Essentials debris, specifically this debris fall number 1. It didn't look very hard. And once I place this debris in 3D space, I can activate its Luma mat, and you can see right away that depth map that I'd rendered out makes it look like the dust is falling all around the object but getting obscured by parts of it. So if I do a curves on this depth map, I can kind of force that dust to look like it's further behind or more in front of this claw. And honestly, I'm just going to start fast forwarding at this point because almost everything else I do is bringing in one 3D card of debris falling and making a duplicate of that depth map layer and just kind of going through and adjusting the curves on it until I like how it's interacting with the 3D object. So for example, the ceiling debris as it's coming down, I can adjust the curves on the depth map a little bit until I have the dust coming in just at the right level that I want, a little bit, behind those front couple claws. I can preview that through, and you'll see a nice obscured claw coming out of that dust. My lighting effect is working in concert with this. Right when we get down here, I can switch over to utilizing that depth map to create some of the glass and stuff that's supposed to be smashing on the interior of this claw machine as it's pulled up into the ceiling. I just take a bunch of these broken glass pieces, I put them on cards, I put some other debris floating on cards, and place them all when I need a depth map. I put it in there, And you get some stuff bouncing off the top of the machine as the dust falls in, some little dust falling from the cracks. All of this will just depend on your comp, so no need to get into the details of it. Just kind of look at your comp and, you know, pepper in a bunch of these materials if you can. Now, one of the things I kind of ignored earlier when I was doing background replacement was the floor layer. So I'm finally going to get around to that because I do need it in here. So one of my guide layers down here was the ground. I'm going to make a duplicate of that. Look at this, delete this checkerboard pattern, and I'm going to add in a 4-color gradient, which basically allows you to sample 4 points of color, and it kind of blends them together. Why I'm doing that is I'm just sampling 4 different colors from spots of the floor that you can see, filling the solid in with roughly those colors so it looks kind of the same. I'm realigning it to fit the floor. I'm going to add a grid pattern using a dark brown color because it's like a tile floor in here. I'm going to scale up the grid until it kind of matches the floor pattern that you see there behind James. I'm going to adjust these 4-color grad points and kind of mix them together to get a little bit brighter. There we go. Now this doesn't have to be exact because I'm going to feather this out a bunch. And the idea is it's really just this bottom of screen and you don't see it much. I'm going to use some corner pins to adjust the perspective so it's right on with the floor perspective in the room. Great, and then I'm going to feather in the only part of the ground I need, which is just right there. And if I add that mask and feather it up a little bit, it looks plenty good. It'll have some motion blur on it, and I'm also going to simulate a little bit of occlusion and contact shadows down here as well. Adjust the corner pinning a little bit more until it kind of aligns with the original. So look at this, just using a bunch of effects to make a checkerboard floor or tile floor. I'm going to sample some black back here so it looks kind of like some shadow on the floor there. I'm going to blur this whole thing just a little bit. Add some noise in to make it kind of simulated video like. And it's not a great patch, but this really isn't supposed to be the part of the screen you're looking at. So hopefully if I've done my job kind of right, if I add in enough shadows and blur and stuff down here, it's really smoke and mirrors. Some of the very last details I added was me looking like an idiot, putting this extension cord on the wall and kind of flopping it around, kind of masking this shape off. And so I could do kind of a Luma key on it and put it to be, and make it hanging off the bottom of my arcade machine. Super high-tech stuff here. I also decided to add some welding sparks coming down from the ceiling. I noticed once I had the final comp out of here that I didn't align these very well, but they work all right. I figure sparks make everything exciting, so at least they're there. Yay, sparks! You can see I'm still using my depth map tools to key in little things like sparks just inside the machine but behind the front claws of the fork, which is really nice. It's cool to be able to composite something right in the middle of your Element 3D rendered object. And that's pretty much it. Honestly, I was a cheapskate and really only was willing to spend $1 to get this thing shot. So I tried to run around and get all of these views and angles as soon as he had put in the $1, because I didn't want to waste any more than that, honestly. So this was, that's why the camera work is so bizarre for this piece, because I'm trying to shoot it within the span of him really playing. And yeah, the whole thing culminates in this effect shot, which we just put together. Crunch, creak, beep, beep, beep. beep. The sound effects add a lot. Beep, beep, beep. And that's the piece. Thank you guys very much for sticking around for this whole tutorial. I know it was about an hour, so congratulations if you made it all the way till the end. I always start with something like 8 to 12 hours of footage and try to compress it into something digestible. So hopefully that works out. I know sometimes it makes things a little bit fast, but obviously your footage is going to be different than my footage. So hopefully if you just get a sample of what the techniques I use are, you'll be able to figure them out in the context of your own project. So feel free to leave any tips or questions about the way you'd like me to do tutorials. I'm always trying to improve. So hopefully you enjoyed this one, and feel free to click on stuff over here. There's probably something up there exciting going on in the world. Click here to subscribe, and thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.